time. Okay. This is a new one. Okay, let's start with the word of prayer. Any need for prayer? Anyone who has a special need for prayer? Okay, Peter has a special need for prayer. Also need prayer for grace and to continue each day. Grace to work with people, grace for other people to work with me. Sometimes we need to pray that the Lord should encourage and strengthen our wives to be able to persevere when they deal with us. Amen. Because some of us prepare them for the time of persecutions. You? No, not yet. Yeah, so sometimes we like to pray for other people, but we need to find out how other people are experiencing us. Is it joy to be with us? When we arrive, do they say, oh, thanks God that this person has arrived? Or maybe they celebrate when we leave. They mourn when we arrive. Welcome. Yeah, so let's pray that. Let's pray for strength. Let's pray for salvation. Let's pray for God's grace. Welcome. Let's pray for God's grace and the semester is just begun, and it might deceive you because it's right at the beginning. Don't wait for the last moment. Some have been hurt. Some have been hurt every year by the same thing. It's no longer a surprise that there's a lot of work towards the end of the semester. We don't have to leave the work until that time. Start working now and pace yourself. Okay, who's praying for us? Who's praying for us? We're not punished. Oh, I wanted to choose Tatenda. It's not a punishment that you were not around. No, but let's ask you to close. Let me ask Elder Erasmus to pray for us.
Most gracious Heavenly Father, Lord, we thank you that we can yet again meet in a class. Lord, as we are going to be studying the book of Revelation, we know that there are some interesting subjects to discover. Lord, as we are gathered here, we ask that you will be with each one of us. As the pastor has said, we are all in need of grace. And may it be so that when we do go visit people, if it's family, friends, or church members, may it be that we can reflect Christ's grace and his character to others. Lord, we ask for your blessing in that what we do. May it be that each one of us will dedicate our lives to you and you alone. This is our prayer in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Just to recap a little before we move forward, I think when we closed, we talked about the 7 keys. We were going to talk about the last key, the chiastic structure. This was going to be the last key that we were going to talk about. We talked about quite a number of issues. That revelation, it's a divine revelation. It's not just a revelation. It came from the mind of God. We talked about the Old Testament, the contribution and the background of the Old Testament. We talked about the New Testament. We talked about the fact that it is an apocalypse. And we also mentioned 2 kinds of apocalyptic branches, historical and mythical. You remember? No, you don't have to remember now. You don't have to remember it. You don't have to remember now. You'll have an opportunity to reflect on it. Yeah. We also talked about the fact that it is a signified book. It's a symbolic book. It's a symbolic book. First and foremost, the point of departure is that the book is symbolic, not literal, symbolic. But we also accept the fact that there are literal issues in the book of Revelation. But first and foremost, we need to decide that the book is guilty for being symbolic than literal, unlike other books. We talked about we also mentioned one symbolism, and we assumed that we are aware of other symbolisms, and we met them in the past. We only introduced one symbolism, the live symbolism. And remember, we mentioned we also pointed out the difference between echo and life symbolism. You don't have to remind me now. You need to remember that for you. Probably next week you might have to remind yourself on that. We also talked. We introduced the chiastic structure of the book. Chiastic structure of the book. The book has chiasm. You remember that in the Hebrew thinking, the climax of the story, it's not at the end. It's not at the end. The story begins here. The climax is right at the beginning. The story reaches its climax right at the middle. Then it then recapitulates itself. Are we together? So even the book of Revelation, the book of Daniel both books follow the same pattern. The story, the climax of the story in Hebrew thinking, it's right in the middle. If you want to know what are the issues in the book of Daniel, you go to Daniel 7, Daniel 8. Of course, Daniel 8 is part of Daniel 9. This is the climax. This is the climax of the story. And immediately after that, the story repeats itself. There is progression and recapitulation. You don't have to worry about those words. Worry about them next week. Is it next week?
Yes.
Or in 2 weeks' time. So the climax is in right in the middle. Right in the middle. The climax of the book of Revelation is between Revelation 12 and Revelation 14. And in fact, some are beginning to talk about the climax of the climax. This is the heart of the story. This is the heart of the book of Revelation. But other people are beginning to pick up the heart of the heart. The heart of the heart. The heart of the heart. So the heart or the center of the book is right in the middle. Right in the middle. You find great controversy. You find quite a number of issues. Great controversy is intensified in chapter 13. And then chapter 14, you find the last message just before the end. The last message. The last message. You get the last message. And when the message is rejected, then immediately after that, you get the punishments. The punishments. And this is how the book is structured. You have... Can I wipe this portion here?
No.
No.
Yeah.
This side? Okay. You find first the epilogue, the introduction of the epilogue, the introduction of the book, which is, you remember we discussed Revelation 1 verse 1 to 8, and we mentioned quite a number of things when we started our class, that even the methods of interpretation are suggested right at the beginning of the chapter. You remember that story? Oh, that is a little bit weak. It's not convincing. Please remind yourself of this. This is the introduction of the book. This is the introduction of the book. Then you have the story about the 7 churches. 7 churches. The 7 churches. The 7 churches of Revelation. That would be from 1:9 up to chapter 3, the rest of chapter 3. That is going to be the story of the 7 churches. Then chapter 4 up to chapter 8, verse 1. Up to chapter 8, verse 1. You get the 7 seals. You get the 7 seals. Get the 7 seals. From verse 8, from chapter 8, verse 2, up to chapter 18, you find the trumpets, the 7 trumpets, the 7 trumpets, the 7 trumpets. Then you are from 11:19. Remember Revelation 11, verse 19. Then I saw the tabernacle opened. So the tabernacle opened, the temple opened in the tabernacle. Chapter 11 up to chapter 14. Chapter 14. This becomes the final crisis. The final crisis, or the center of the book. The center of the book, or the heart of the matter. The heart of the matter. That's where we get quite a number of things. In fact, the story in chapter, from this to this story, the story is also introduced by the sanctuary. Because chapter 11, verse 19, talks about the temple. The temple opened in heaven. And it introduces the final crisis. In fact, even the seven trumpets are introduced by a scene in the temple. By the scene in the temple. The seven churches are also introduced by the candlesticks, by the sanctuary language. You remember we mentioned that whenever a new prophecy is introduced, you find a sanctuary scene and you find sanctuary language. Then immediately you know you are right at the you are now starting a new information. Okay. Then immediately after that, once you get to the center, then you go back to I think it's chapter 15 up to chapter 15, 16, 17. Up to chapter 17, you find the seven plagues. The seven plagues. The seven plagues. Then you read about millennium. I think it's chapter 20. 15. The plagues are very much tricky because you have 7 plagues. You also have the destruction of Babylon. So
18
that
and 19.
up to 19. In fact, this the destruction of Babylon is not a new plague, but it's a new focus. It's still the same punishment, but what God is saying, now I want to focus to Babylon. Babylon has been a menace to my children. I want to focus to Babylon. Okay. Then chapter 20, you get the story of millennium. The spelling. Millennium. Don't worry about the spelling. You need to worry. Then you there is also the New Jerusalem. The New Jerusalem. The New Jerusalem. Ooh. Jerusalem. Then you find
It's the outro.
the closing of the book. What do you call the closing? This one is called the epilogue. This one is called what?
The prologue.
This is prologue. This is the epilogue. The epilogue. And if you, it's chapter 22, I think chapter 22 from verse 4, you get the epilogue. And you discover that the language here, it's almost the same with the language. There are some similarities. And this becomes the center of the story, or the climax of the story. The 7 churches are very much linked to the New Jerusalem. To the New Jerusalem. The seven trumpets are also linked to the 7 plagues. Both of them are punishments. The 7 seals are linked to millennium. The era, the glories of the gospel, and also the persecutions of the saints during the same time. But this time is the glories of the saints, the saints are enjoying. So the story finds the plot climaxes at Revelation 11:19 to 14. That is the climax. Now there are several issues that take place in this story. The great controversy. In fact, the story, if you study the story closely, you discover that the story not only starts with the cross, but it even goes even before, up to the time of Babylon. From Babylon to the end of time. To the end of time. So the story is, the story climaxes and recapitulates again. Okay? So you find a lot of these. You find a lot of these. Well, remember we're talking about key number 7, which is the chiastic structure of the book of Revelation. So this is one of the tools that we use to interpret, to understand the book of Revelation. So when we study the book, we need to have this in mind. We need to have this in mind. We need to have this in mind. Okay. Any question before we move? Any question before we move? Let me not wipe this side. Let me wipe this side. Now, when we study the book of Revelation, it's not a linear book. It's not the prophecies. Yes, they begin from the time of the prophet, but they are not just a linear story up to the time of the end. Let me show you something. Like you have the seven churches. The story does not continue this way. That after 7 churches, you have the 7 seals. Then after the 7 seals, you have the 7 trumpets. Then immediately after that, you have the climax of the story. Then after that, you have the 7 plagues. Then up until the second coming of Christ. This is not the sequence of events. Are we together? Because once you present them this way, you give the impression that these events take place before these events. Are we together? So that if you explain, you'll say, well, we are in the time of the 7 churches. Or we are no longer in the time of the 7 churches, we are in the time of the... That's not how it is presented. That's not how... We need to understand it in terms of recapping, recapitulation. Are we together? So you have the 7 churches. You have the 7 churches. Up to the time of the end. Up to the time of the end. And the 7 churches are intended to tell a different story. This is the history of the church. Are we together? The history of the condition of the church. Then you also have, parallel to it, you have the seals, the 7 seals. The same time frames, but different emphasis. You remember its progression. The story, you still read about the same story, but the emphasis is different. Are we together? The emphasis is different. Then the 7 trumpets. The 7 trumpets, again, starting from the time of the cross, up to, not necessarily from the time of the cross, the starting point may not be the same, but they are parallel. For instance, the trumpets would start somewhere in AD 70. AD 70. Because of the nature and the meaning of the trumpets. Okay. These are punishments. So punishments only started, but still parallel to this era, up to the time of the end. Up to the time of the end. Talk about the plagues. The plagues would be somewhere towards the time of the end. Up to the end of time. At some point they are parallel, they run parallel. But the point of departure might be different. Based on the emphasis or the story that is being told. Are we together? Yes. So that's why we have recapitulation and progression. Recapitulation. So we don't have this kind of, some tell the story this way, And we don't get that. We don't get that. Well, once you tell the story in this sequence, then we have a very, very long time on earth. Very, very long time. But it may not fit the historical events. It may not fit the historical events. Okay? Don't forget, these are symbolic. All of them are symbolic. These are symbolic. These are symbolic. The 7 churches, the 7 seals, the 7 trumpets, but they symbolize events in history. It might be a punishment, it might be a blessing, but they symbolize events in history. Okay? Are we moving together? Okay. Okay. Let's wipe this side. Just a bit. I want to introduce something else. There is a word that is called an interlude. Interlude. You always find interludes almost in almost all prophecies.
144,000.
Except with the 7 churches. You don't find an interlude. You don't find an interlude. But with the seven seals, an interlude, it's an event within the plot, within the prophecy. It's an event within the prophecy where the prophet or God, it's like there is an event that is moving towards the future, or the event that is unfolding. As if somewhere someone intercepts an event and asks a question. What is going on there? And the event is stopped to address that question. So the question within the interlude, the question is answered during the interlude. And immediately after, when the question has been answered, then the story continues to unfold. Does it make sense? Yes.
I wanted to ask about the interlude.
I want to give you an example first. Maybe the example will address that.
Okay.
Is it fine?
Okay.
Let me give you a typical example. But do you understand how the interlude works? It's something that disturbs the story. It disturbs the flow. But it's a good disturbance of the story. It's a pleasant surprise.
670.
That's one of them. 6:17. Chapter 6, verse 17. There is an interlude.
And the question also.
It's actually a question. You're correct. It's also a question. Who will be able to stand? You know, it comes after the sixth seal.
Yeah.
The sixth seal. Within the sixth seal, there are two events. You have events in nature.
Mm-hmm.
Events in nature, and those events are historical. Talks about the falling of the stars, the sun turning to red, this and that, the moon. You get the historical effect, the earthquake, this and that. Then immediately after that, you get the actual second coming. Second coming. And you find there's a lot of activity there. People are running to the mountains according to the story. Mountains fall on us. We cannot look at the person who's coming, running away from the lamb and the father. And everyone is running away. And I hope we will not be running away. I just hope and pray. But everyone is running for cover. Then someone asks a question. Hey, everyone is running. Who will be able to stand? Oh, okay, wait. Just wait the coming of Christ. Halt that event. Someone has asked the question. And this is the last verse. Then chapter 7, the entire chapter, answers the question, who will be able to stand? You find this. You find quite a number of interludes. In fact, even among the plagues. And whenever there is an interlude, saints are encouraged. Saints are encouraged. Whenever there is an interlude, you get hope from the interlude. You get the 144,000 and or the multitudes. Ooh, what am I saying?
Yeah.
The 144,000.
It's end.
Yeah. I'm trying to accommodate others who might have strange ideas. Because we are not discussing this for now, so that they are not upset. Those will say, and all. And all. Depending where you are comfortable. We are not fighting at the moment. We're just talking about interlude. We're not we're not discussing this. There's a long discussions on this. But here's an interlude. And also it also introduces us to the events unseen. This interlude, where you discover that God is doing something in arresting the activities of Satan. You live in your little corner. Ask yourself the question: how come that the devil is so strong that the devil knows that his time is but short? How come that we survive each night, each day? Sometimes we forget to pray. Sometimes we forget to confess our sins. But we still survive the following day. And see, sometimes we cheat here and there, tell lies here and there. And we are still here. God is holding, because the devil is waiting for just one moment. You commit one sin, he wants you killed so that you don't have a chance to come back. You don't have a chance to respond to that call. Why would you die in your sin, Israel? Who's keeping this? You get that in the interlude. So it is because of his mercies that we are not consumed. It's not because of the fact that we're important. It's because of his mercies. And those mercies should cause us to keep on asking ourselves a question: are my hands clean? Is my mouth clean? Are my thoughts pure? Are my relationships good and healthy?
So, after this interlude, then chapter 8, verse 1, the seals continue with the seventh seal.
Yes, up to chapter 8, verse 1. Chapter 8, verse 1, that is the last seal. The last seal. You remember that silence in heaven for 30 minutes? Yeah. And immediately after that, we are introduced to the trumpets. And you also find a sanctuary scene. Sanctuary scene, chapter 8, verse 2. So up to here, this is the immediately after that, immediately after this event, after the question has been answered, then the event continues, the second coming of Christ. And this part is also linked to the second coming of Christ, because it talks about the silence that is going to be there. We'll talk about that when we get to the text itself. So you find the interludes. Now, if someone in future asks you a question, what is the function of the interlude? If someone asks you a question, the interlude is to respond to questions. And gives clarity. It gives clarity to the plot or to the story. Okay. Yes, I think I want to use. Let me use the. Can you turn on the I want us to go to the sanctuary scenes in the book of Revelation. If there is no question, I want to move away from this part. No, but maybe before that, Peter, just to give a broad view of the book of Revelation before we get to that. Okay, we have the seven. The first scene. The first. Oh. This is introduced by Revelation 1 verse 10. Revelation 1:10. Revelation 1:10. This is a very important verse among us Adventists. Very much important. Very much important. But at the same time, we are not stranded as Adventists. I've heard people trying to prove the validity of the Sabbath from this verse. Validity of the Sabbath from this text. When we do that, we demonstrate that we are a little bit stranded, as if once someone removes this, then we have nothing. We have nothing. We have the testimony of the Old Testament and the testimony of the New Testament. Yes, this text, I want to believe, refers to the Sabbath. I want to believe it refers to the Sabbath. And I want to believe that John saw the visions. The visions were seen on Sabbath. Oh, the visions were seen. John traveled on Sabbath. Oh, you have a problem with that. John was transported on Sabbath.
Yeah.
John was transported on Sabbath. You remember we have those that feel that Revelation 1 verse 7 talks about the second coming of Christ. And we believe that they are correct. Second coming of Christ. And the argument is when you see this theme is introduced at the beginning of the book, and also you find this theme repeated in the several times in chapter 22. And you also, chapter 22, you also get the impression that there is a burden in John's prayer. Come, Lord Jesus, come. You find that burden. And it is introduced in chapter. So therefore, the burden of the book of Revelation is the second coming of Christ. Come, Lord Jesus. Come, Lord Jesus. Please come and take us. So you remember in apocalyptic, one of the apocalyptic features is the need not to change the local environment, but for Christ to come. You remember there is that need. There is that need. And on the basis of these two views, some even among our ranks have decided that this text should be interpreted to mean the second coming of Christ. Second coming of Christ. And the argument is the context. The context is the second coming of Christ. They argue from exegesis. What is the context? This and that. And arguing from the linguistics, and we find one of those, it's Uncle Sam Bakioki. But he uses the word eschatological day of the Lord. Eschatological day of the Lord. And the reason he gives for arguing this way, he says, when he was doing his research in Rome, his PhD, he could not find material in history. Remember, he's a church historian. He could not find material in church history to prove that this text He was actually researching on the change, the history of the change of the Sabbath to Sunday. So he was trying to prove that there has been a change in history, and some of the texts have been changed or have been reinterpreted. And he wanted to check in history what was the understanding of this text. And he could not find a thing. Now later on, after he had done his work, when he was asked, but why did you resort to this? He said, I have used the context to argue. I've used the context to argue, but I also did not fall into the temptation of taking the day of the Lord to mean Sunday. Because the world now believes that this is Sunday. Catholic Church believes this is Sunday. So in order to avoid this view and not to entangle on this view, because there was no historical data to prove this, then he went for this option. And he argued it within the context. He used the context and the burden of the book. And I must mention that quite a number of scholars are beginning to say, is there a possibility of marrying the two? Because this view is based on the text itself, an honest reading of the text. Is there of marrying the two, that the visions were seen on Sabbath, that is, on Sabbath, John was transported to the second coming of Christ. One of the person who's pushing this is Jack Dukan. He's saying there is a basis to look at this. Instead of fighting, yes, something took place on Sabbath, and we believe that this was the Sabbath. This verse refers to the Sabbath, not Sunday, not even the Emperor Day. You remember there was an issue about the Emperor Day, not even the Emperor Day. This could not have been possible because John is a Jewish prophet, so he would not have pushed this agenda. He would not have argued for Emperor Day. He would not have argued for Sunday. As a Jewish prophet, and given the fact that the framework of the book of Revelation is actually the sanctuary, and the sanctuary incorporates the Sabbath. So it makes sense to believe that John had the Sabbath in mind. John had the Sabbath in mind. And the idea of the Sabbath, I want to believe that he had the Sabbath in mind. Because somewhere in the, you remember I mentioned the heart of the book of Revelation, the climax of the book of Revelation. In fact, from chapter 11, verse 19, you see the open temple. You see the open temple, and you also see the ark of the covenant. I want to believe that the theme of the Sabbath is introduced in Revelation chapter 10. I want to believe it is introduced. And later on, in the climax, you get the covenant. You see the covenant. You see the temple opened. You remember when you talk about the temple in the Old in the New Testament, we talk about when John thinks of the temple, he does not think of the entire structure of the sanctuary, but he only thinks about the most holy place. You remember there used to be the holy place and the most holy place. So John, this is the temple. Because the temple is opened and the Ark of the Covenant is seen. The Ark is housed in the temple. Not in the temple, not in the tabernacle. The tabernacle is a complex. And the complex has rooms. One of the rooms is the temple. Are we together? Now, the temple houses the covenant. The covenant houses the 10 Commandments?
The 10 Commandments houses the Sabbath.
The house is Sabbath. The 10 Commandments house the Sabbath. And this is introduced right. And I want and this from this chapter we discover that we are actually moving into the second half of the sanctuary from chapter 11. Are we together? Are we still moving together? I'm trying to make a point that the Sabbath, there is a basis. Whenever the issue is introduced right at the beginning, you will discover it later on. And the Sabbath, I'm trying to make a case that the Sabbath is introduced also. Okay? The environment of the Sabbath is introduced in chapter, and after that we read verses like chapter 12, verse 17. You remember? Chapter 12, verse 17. You begin to talk about those that keep the commandments of God and faith of Jesus Christ. But right at the heart, chapter 12 to chapter 14. And notice chapter 12, verse 17. There is also the commandments. But I want you to go to chapter 14, verse 6 and 7. Chapter 14 to 6 and 7. You discover the language of the Sabbath. The language of the Sabbath. You discover the language of the Sabbath. Not the word Sabbath is not found there, but the language of the Sabbath. The one who made the sea, the earth,
fountains of waters.
And fountains of waters. And this is the language of Exodus. This is language of Exodus chapter 20, verse 11. And this is the language of the commandments. The language of the Sabbath. The language of the Sabbath. And the point is, you remember this is the climax of the climax is chapter 12 to chapter 14. Chapter 12 to chapter 14. After chapter 12 discusses quite a number. There are 3 events that take place in chapter 12. We still have 5 minutes. Yes, we have 5 minutes. Let's go that. There are 3 events. There is we find a woman plus Christ. Then there is also the activity of the red dragon. Red dragon. Now let me not include let me talk about the events. There is the event of the birth of Christ. Birth of Christ. There is the persecution of the church. There's a persecution. Then there is the emergence of the remnant. Of remnant. In fact, the word remnant is used, or the seed. The birth of Christ, find the birth of Christ, and you find a woman, but that woman does not give birth. That woman is not Mary. Are we together? That woman is not Mary. Why do we believe it's not Mary? Because she's
living very long.
She lives within 1,002. She was persecuted for 1,260 days. And that was long after Mary died. So it's the church from the time of Mary up to this period gave birth to Christ. So that Christ is a product of the church. I'm just using a loose language. Not the product of Mary. Mary represented the church. Then you find the persecution of Mary, persecution within this time. Okay? Then after this period, there is a remnant that is introduced. And when the remnant is introduced, chapter 13 chapter 13, the red dragon becomes upset that, hey, there is another group. I've been dealing with this group. There's another group, a new group. And the description of the remnant are those that keep the commandments of God, the faith of Jesus Christ. And he then says, hey, I can't do this alone. Chapter 13, he mobilizes. He mobilizes. And I want to suggest to you that we live post 1260 days after this prophecy. After this prophecy. And it's going to be bad for the remnant. The remnant is an issue of the future. An issue of the future. And the climax, the issues involve the 10 Commandments of God. The issues are going to involve the 10 Commandments of God. And not just the 10 Commandments of God, but the issue is going to be the Sabbath. So, you have the heart. You have the heart, which is 12 to 14. But then you have the heart of the heart. The heart of the heart. Or the center, which is chapter 14, verse 6 and 7. What is the point? The heart of Revelation is the Sabbath. The issue in the end time is going to be the Sabbath. This is the message that we get from the... And what are the implications to us today? We are going to minister when the Sabbath has become an issue. Probably in our lifetime or after we disappeared from the scene. So the Sabbath is going to become an issue. So these are real issues. These are not just the issues of theology. These are the issues of the heart. These are the issues of the heart. So our ministry takes place within this context. And I believe these events are true. These prophecies are true. And if what I believe is true, then it can't be business as usual. We can't preach sermons as if we live before 1260 or before 1844. You remember, according to Daniel, this marks the end of time. This marks the end of time. And according to the heart of the book, the remnant will emerge after this period. After this period. And I want to suggest that somewhere in 1844, God appointed a remnant. Post this period, post 1798, God appointed a remnant. Let's hold on for now. We will continue with this. Next time when we start, we will look at the sanctuary scenes in the book of Revelation. I want us to get into the sanctuary. And please read the Leviticus story. Read, immerse yourself into the sanctuary so that this makes sense. The book of Revelation makes sense. Thank you very much.